It is evening in a small English village some 700 years ago, and the day's work is nearly done. The light is fading over the green, and a thin smoke rises from the cottages along the lane. Somewhere a dog barks once and falls quiet, and a gate is latched, and the fields settle into dusk, and the slow, ordinary business of keeping the peace goes on, as it has for 100 years. Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Archive. Tonight we are going to drift very gently into the world of medieval crime and punishment. The little quarrels and the petty thefts, the village court upon the green, the stocks in the market square, the slow, careful way that a small community once kept order among its own, without police and without prisons as we know them. We will sit in the alehouse where a brawl begins and stand by while the reeve takes down a name, and watch the steward read his roll in the manor hall, and follow the gravest cases out to the very edge of the village. None of it is urgent. None of it is loud. It is just history told slowly, the way it might have unfolded on any ordinary day. As always, there is nothing here you need to do. You don't have to follow the story, or hold the names, or stay awake until the end. If your thoughts wander off, let them. If you lose the thread, that is perfectly fine. This is the kind of telling you are allowed to fall asleep inside. So, settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the blankets feel heavier. Let your breathing slow and lengthen and soften. Whenever you are ready, close your eyes. Let's begin. The village where our story unfolds is a small one, a cluster of cottages set about an open green. There is a church with a squat grey tower, and a mill by the stream, and the great house of the manor beyond. The fields lie in long strips around it, and the woods press close at the edges, dark and full of their own quiet. It is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and has known them all their lives. A man is not just a man here. He is his father's son, and his neighbor's neighbor, and a face seen every day. There are no strangers, and so there are few secrets, and what one person does, the whole village soon hears of. This closeness is the first thing to understand about justice in such a place. There was no force of guards, no constable on patrol, no distant office to send a complaint to. The keeping of order was the work of the village itself, of the neighbors, bound together by old custom. If a sheep went missing, The village knew whose it was, and who had been seen near the fold. If a fence was broken, or a furrow ploughed too wide, the wrong was plain, and the wronged man spoke up. Justice here was not a thing that came from far away. It rose up from the soil, from the people who lived on it. The green at the heart of the village was where much of it happened, in the open, before all eyes. Here the court would meet, and here disputes were aired, and here, at times, a punishment was carried out. It was a worn patch of common grass, trodden bare in places, with the great well at one side, and an old elm at the other. The geese crossed it, and the children played upon it, and the cattle were driven over it at morning and at dusk. In the spring the green ran soft and muddy, churned by hooves and rain, and in the high summer it baked hard and pale. In autumn the fallen leaves of the old elm gathered upon it, and in winter it lay white and silent under the frost. And in every season it was the same green, the shared ground of the village, walked and worked and gathered upon by all alike. And on the days when the court sat, the same green became for a few hours a place of judgment and of weight. There is something to be said before we go on, for the slowness of it all, for the lack of hurry. Justice here did not race. It waited for the court day, and it heard each matter in its turn, and it took its time. And so we begin in this ordinary place, on this ordinary green, where the long, slow work of keeping the peace was done. Among the men of the village, there was one whose task it was to keep an eye on things. He was called the reeve, chosen each year by his neighbors, often a steady farmer of middling sort. It was not an honor that many sought, for it brought much trouble and little reward, but someone had to do it. The reeve stood between the village and the lord of the manor, and answered to both. He saw that the work of the fields was done, that the rents were gathered, that the rules were kept, and when a wrong was done, it was often the reeve who first took note of it, and saw that it was set right. He was helped in this by an old and clever arrangement, a way of binding men to watch one another. The men of the village were grouped into small bands of about 10, and each band was called a tithing. Every man over 12 belonged to one, and each tithing was answerable for the conduct of its members. Once a year, there was a special reckoning of it, a checking that every man was in his proper tithing. The reeve and the steward would call the roll and see that none had slipped through, none gone unaccounted. For a man who belonged to no tithing, belonged to no one, and was a danger, a loose thread in the weave of the village. If a man in a tithing did wrong, his fellows were bound to bring him before the court. And if they did not, if they let him slip away, the whole tithing might be fined for the failure. And so each man had a quiet reason to watch his neighbor and to keep him from straying too far. It was a system built not on gods, but on trust and on the weight of shared responsibility. A man behaved, in part, because his friends and kin would answer for him if he did not. And the reeve, for his part, carried this weight for a year, and then was glad to lay it down again. He was no paid official, no man set above his neighbors, but one of them chosen and serving his turn. When his year was done, another took up the task, and the old reeve went back to his own fields and his own quiet. And so, in this small and watchful way, the village held itself together, neighbor by neighbor. There was one moment when the whole village became, for a little while, the law itself. It happened when a serious wrong was caught in the act, a theft, an assault, a man fleeing with stolen goods. Then the one who saw it would raise a great shout, a cry of alarm, and this was called the hue and cry. The moment the cry went up, every man and woman who heard it was bound by custom to answer. They were to drop whatever they held, take up a staff or a tool, and join in the chase. The whole village would turn out, pouring from the cottages and the fields after the fleeing wrongdoer. It was a duty, not a choice. To hear the hue and cry and ignore it was itself an offense. A man who shut his door and turned away could be fined for failing to come to his neighbor's aid. And so, when the shout rose, doors flew open, and the lane filled with running feet. The cry could carry far, from field to field, from cottage to cottage, passed on by every mouth that heard it. A man at his plough would hear it faint across the furrows, and straighten, and listen, and then set off at a run. And in this way the whole countryside could be roused in minutes, the alarm spreading like ripples on a pond. Imagine the scene of it on a quiet afternoon, a cry, sharp and sudden, breaking the calm, then voices taking it up, one after another, spreading across the village like a wave. And then the people streaming out, calling to one another, following the chase across the fields. It was the village defending itself all together in the only way it could. There was no one else to call. The neighbors were the watch and the chase and the catching of the thief. It bound them, this duty, in a way that is hard for us to feel now, who call upon distant help. For here there was no distant help. The man beside you in the field was your guard, and you were his. And when the cry went up, you ran, not for a wage, nor by command, but because it was simply what was done. And when it was over, and the wrongdoer was caught and held, the village went back to its work, the peace restored. From time to time, the village came together for a more solemn gathering, to settle its affairs. This was the moot, the meeting of the court, held in the open air upon the green or in the manor hall. The men of the village assembled, the reeve presided, and the business of the community was set in order. It was not a grand affair. There were no wigs, no robes, no high benches of polished wood. There were only the villagers themselves, standing or sitting on the grass in their everyday clothes. And yet here, in this plain gathering, real matters were weighed and real judgments were given. The court met on fixed days, and word went round beforehand of when it would sit. The people gathered, and the matters were brought forward one by one, and each was heard in its turn. Small debts, broken agreements, quarrels over land, all the ordinary frictions of village life. A man would state his complaint plainly, and the other would answer, and the neighbors would listen. There were no lawyers to speak for them. Each spoke for himself, in his own words, before the rest. And the court, knowing all the parties and all the history behind the dispute, would find its way to a judgment. There was a wisdom in this nearness, for the court was never deceived by a clever stranger's tale. The men who judged had seen the quarrel grow, perhaps over the seasons, and knew the rights and wrongs of it already. And so a great deal could be left unsaid, and the truth came quickly to the surface among people who knew one another so well. The court had its own slow rhythms, its pauses and its murmurs, its turning to this man and that for a word. Nothing was hurried, and nothing was hidden, for there was little that could be hidden in so small a place. A man's character was known, his temper, his honesty, the whole long history of his dealings with his neighbors. It was justice by neighbors, for neighbors rooted in long memory and common sense. What was decided here was not written in great books of law, but held in the minds of the people. And so the moot upon the green did its quiet work, settling the small troubles of a small place. let us listen to one such matter, small and ordinary, the kind the court heard 100 times. A pig had strayed from one man's yard into another man's garden and rooted up a row of young beans. The owner of the garden was aggrieved, and the owner of the pig was summoned to answer for it. The two men stood before the court, neither of them a stranger, both known to all who watched. The gardener spoke first, describing the damage, the broken row, the trampled earth, the lost beans. And the pig's owner answered, allowing the harm, but pleading that the gate had been left open by another. The neighbors listened, nodding, for they knew the gate, and the garden, and the pig, and the men. There was no great mystery to unravel here. The facts were plain, and the only question was the remedy. And so the court conferred among itself, weighing the loss, and what would be fair to ask. It was decided that the pig's owner should pay a small sum to make good the ruined beans. A few pennies, no more, set against the worth of the garden's loss as the neighbors judged it, and the pig's owner agreed, for it was fair, and the gardener was content, and the matter was ended. And the two men, who had stood as opponents for an hour, walked away together easily enough, for they were neighbors still, and would be neighbors tomorrow, and the next day, and all the years after. The quarrel had been a small thing, weighed and settled, and there was no profit in carrying it further. This was the daily bread of the village court, not great crimes, but small wrongs set quietly right. A strayed pig, a broken fence, a debt unpaid, a sharp word turned to a blow. The ordinary frictions of people living close together smoothed away, one small judgment at a time. Now and then, in the gathering, a man sat a little apart, with a board across his knees. Before him was a long strip of parchment, and in his hand a quill, and an inkhorn at his side. He was the clerk, and his task was to set down in faded brown ink the doings of the court. For the village court kept a record called the court roll, a sheet of every meeting and its business. On it were written the names of those summoned, the wrongs complained of, and the judgments given. The fines were noted, and the debts, and the small fees that the court itself was owed. The clerk wrote in a cramped and hurried hand, in a Latin shortened and clipped to save room. He set down only what was needed: a name, a fault, a sum, no long account of the quarrel itself. And when the meeting was done, the roll was rolled up and kept safe to be brought out at the next. These rolls were a kind of memory for the village, a record longer than any single life. They held the history of the place, who had paid and who had not, what had been decided and when. A dispute over a boundary might be settled by turning back to a judgment made 30 years before. The ink itself faded slowly over the long years, browning upon the parchment, growing faint and hard to read. But the rolls were kept, all the same, tied and stored in a chest or a dry corner of the hall, and a careful steward could unroll them and squint at the old cramped hand and find a matter long forgotten. And so the law of the village was not only in the minds of the living, but on these strips of parchment, rolled up and tied and stored away, the slow accumulation of small justices over the long years. A quiet, patient record, written by candlelight, of an ordinary village keeping its own peace. When a hard question came before the court, one to which the answer was not plain, what then? There were no thick books of statute to consult, no shelf of law for the reeve to take down. Instead, the village turned to something older and softer, to custom, and to the memory of its oldest men. For the law of the manor was, above all, the custom of the manor, the way things had always been done. How wide a furrow might be ploughed, how many beasts a man might graze upon the common, what was owed to the lord, and what was owed between neighbors, all of it held in custom, not in print. And when custom was in doubt, the court called upon the elders, the grey-haired men who remembered. They would be asked how a thing had been done in their father's time, and their father's father's time, and they would tell it slowly, leaning on a stick, and their telling carried great weight. For in a village, memory was law. What the old men recalled was taken as the truth of the matter. A boundary, a right of way, a duty owed, all could rest on the recollection of an aged neighbor. And so the young listened to the old, not only out of respect, but because the old held the law within them. There was a dignity in old age, then, that came from this, from the holding of the village's memory. A man grown grey was not set aside as useless, but valued, for he carried in his head what no book held. When he spoke of how things had been done, the young fell quiet and listened and took it as their guide. There was a kind of patience in this, a slowness that suited the slow turning of village years. Nothing was decided in haste. The court reached back into the past and let it guide the present. And the custom of the place, carried in living memory, kept the village steady, season after season. And so the village kept its peace by neighbors and custom and the long memory of the old. But peace is never quite complete, and where men gather to drink, small troubles have a way of beginning. So let us leave the green now and step through a low doorway into the warm and smoky alehouse. At the edge of the green stood a cottage, no different from the rest, save for one small sign. A bundle of evergreen, an ale stake, was tied above the door, and it meant that here, today, ale was for sale. For there was no permanent tavern in a small village. Ale was brewed at home and sold when there was a batch. The brewing was women's work, done in the great cottages and the small alike, whenever grain allowed. And when a household had ale to spare, it hung out the bush, and the neighbors came to drink. And so the alehouse moved about the village, from door to door, wherever the ale stake hung that week. This week it hung above the door of the alewife, a woman known for her good and steady brew. Inside, her main room was dim and low, the air thick with the smell of malt and wood smoke. A fire burned in the hearth, and benches stood along the walls, and men sat with wooden cups in their hand. It was warm in there, and close, and full of the sound of talk, the day's labor set aside for an hour. Men came to drink, and to hear the news, and to argue, and to forget the ache in their backs. The ale was thick and brown, brewed weak for daily drinking, and it loosened the tongue and warmed the blood. Ale, you must understand, was not a luxury in that world, but a daily food, drunk by everyone, young and old. The water was not always to be trusted, and the small ale, weak and nourishing, was the safer drink. So a man might drink ale with his breakfast, and at noon, and at night, and think nothing of it at all. The strength of it varied, from the small ale drunk by the children, to the stronger brew kept for a feast. Most of what was drunk day by day was weak, thin stuff, more food than drink, taken without much thought. But on a holy day, or a wedding, or after the harvest, a stronger ale was brewed, and then men grew merry. This was the heart of the village's small pleasures, and also, at times, of its small troubles. For where men sit close, and the ale flows, old quarrels are remembered, and new ones begun. And the alehouse, warm and welcome though it was, kept the village court in steady business. The alewife herself was a figure of some standing in the village, for all that her trade was humble. She knew the craft of brewing, the soaking of the grain, the warming, the long patient wait for the ale to work. Her ale was trusted, and her door was busy, and she made a small, steady living from the thirst of her neighbors. But brewing was watched, for ale was a thing that could be cheated, and the court kept an eye on it. There were rules about the price, set by custom and by the lord, so that no alewife charged too dear. And there were rules about the measure, that a man should get the full quantity he paid for. To see to this, the village had an officer with a curious name, the ale taster or ale conner. It was his task to go round to each brewing to taste the ale and to judge whether it was good. He would test its strength and its quality, and he would check the measures used to serve it. If the ale was weak or sour or sold in measures too small, the alewife was brought before the court, and there she would be fined a small and regular sum for selling ale against the assize. So common was this, that the fine was almost a kind of license, paid again and again, year by year. The alewife of our village paid her fine like all the rest, and thought little of it. It was simply part of the trade, a small cost of doing business, expected and accepted. And she went on brewing and selling and hanging out her bush, and the village went on drinking. Brewing was one of the few trades open to a woman, and many a wife earned her own small coin by it. A widow especially might keep herself by her brewing, with no husband's field to lean upon. And so the alewife was a figure of some independence in a world that gave women little of it. But not every alewife was honest, and the matter of the measure was a common cause of grievance. For ale was sold by the gallon, the pottle, the quart, and each had its proper vessel, marked and known, and there was always the temptation for the sly seller to use a cup a little smaller than it ought to be, a measure shaved down, a jug with a thicker bottom, a pot that looked full but held a touch less. Over a day of selling, these small cheats added up, a little more grain saved, a little more profit kept, and the drinker, with his rough cup in the dim light, might never notice he had been short-changed. But the village noticed in time, for the village noticed everything in the end. A man would grumble that the ale at such a house did not go as far as it used to, and another would agree, and the talk would spread, and at last the matter would reach the court. When a cellar was found to give short measure, the false vessel itself was the evidence. It would be brought before the court and set beside the true measure, and the difference plainly shown. And the seller would be fined and shamed a little before the neighbors, for the cheat was a mean one. For to give short measure was to steal quietly a sip at a time from every customer. It was not a great crime, but it was a petty and a sneaking one, and the village despised it. And so the measures were watched, and the cheats were caught, and honest selling was mostly kept. For trust in the measure was a small thing and a great thing both, in a place where all bought and sold. If a man could not trust the cup he drank from, nor the loaf he bought, then the whole market faltered. A true gallon, a true pound, an honest pint, these were the quiet foundations on which the daily trade rested. It was late in the afternoon, and the alehouse was full, and the talk had grown loud and warm. Two men sat near the fire, neighbors of long standing, who had between them an old and tender grievance. It was some small matter of a debt, or a boundary, or a slight half forgotten, the kind that never quite dies. The ale had loosened them, and the old grievance, which they kept buried by day, rose up between them. One made a remark, half in jest, with a sharp edge to it, and the other took it ill, and the answer came back sharper still, and the warmth of the room seemed to draw in close and tighten. The men around them grew quiet, for they knew the signs, and they had seen it before. The two faces reddening, the voices rising, the hands tightening upon the wooden cups, and the others drew back a little, leaving a space, and watched to see which way it would go. It might have ended there, with hard words and nothing more, the two of them parting sour. Many quarrels did. The ale spoke, and the men growled, and then the moment passed and was forgotten. But this one did not pass. One man rose and leaned across the bench and spoke a word too far, and the room held its breath in the firelight, waiting on the edge of the thing. For a quarrel by the fire was a small matter, until the moment that it was not. And this quarrel, it seemed, had reached that moment, there in the warm and smoky dark. It is a strange thing how an old grievance can sleep for years and then wake in an instant over nothing. A word, a look, a slight half imagined, and all the buried resentment comes rushing up at once. The two men had drunk together 100 times and would again, but tonight the old wound had opened. Then the first blow was struck, and the quarrel became a brawl, and the alehouse stirred to life. A cup was knocked from a hand and clattered to the floor, and a bench scraped back, and a voice cried out. The two men closed, grappling, knocking against the table, and the others rose up around them. It was not a grand fight, not a thing of skill or weapons, but a clumsy, heaving scuffle. Fists swung wide and mostly missed. Bodies pushed and shoved in the cramped and crowded room. The fire was nearly trodden into, and a jug went over, and the ale spread dark across the boards. And then, as quickly as it began, it was pulled apart, for the others would not let it run. Strong hands took the fighters by the shoulders and drew them back and held them fast. The alewife was scolding now, sharp and weary, for the spilled ale and the broken cup. The two men stood breathing hard, held back by their neighbors, glaring still but no longer striking. One had a cut lip, and the other a reddening eye, and both had torn the other's tunic. And around them the room slowly settled, the danger past, the damage counted up. But the matter would not end there, for blows had been struck, and blood a little drawn. That was a thing for the court. A brawl was an offence, a breach of the peace, to be answered for. And so, even as the two men were let go, the others were already saying, "This must go before the reeve." For a brawl was not just a private matter between two men, but a breach of the king's peace itself. Blood drawn, a blow struck in anger. These were wrongs against the whole community's quiet, not the victim alone. And so the village could not simply let it pass, even had the two men wished to forget it between themselves. Amid the confusion of the brawl, another small wrong was being done, quietly, in the dark. For while all eyes were on the fight, a nimble hand was at work among the press of bodies. A young man, no more than a boy really, moved through the crowd, and his fingers found a hanging purse. In those days, a man carried his coins in a small pouch at his belt, tied or hung from a cord. And in the crush and tumult of the fight, a quick blade could cut the cord, and the purse was gone. The owner, his eyes on the fighters, would feel nothing and miss it only much later. The boy did his work cleanly. A small knife, a quick stroke, and the purse dropped into his palm. He slipped it into his own coat and edged toward the door, his face calm, as though he were only leaving, and in the noise and the shoving, no one marked him, and he passed out into the cool evening air. This was the cutpurse, the petty thief who haunted any gathering of people and their coins. A fair, a market, a brawl, a crowd. Anywhere men pressed close and grew careless of their belts. And the medieval world, with its loose pouches and its crowds, gave such a one many chances. For there were no banks, no notes, no wealth locked away, only the coins a man carried on his own body. And so, a purse cut from a belt was a real loss, perhaps a week's earnings gone in a single stroke. The thief risked much for it, for the law was hard, but the reward was there, hanging at every careless hip. In the great towns there were said to be whole bands of such thieves schooled in the trade. But in a small village it was a lonelier business, a single hungry soul taking a chance in the dark. And the village cutpurse was nearly always known in the end, for there were few places for a stranger's coin to go. But the village was small, and a strange coin spent freely would be noticed, and questions asked. The boy had got clean away tonight, but the purse would be missed, and the hue raised in time, and the long memory of the village and the watchful eyes of the neighbors were not so easily escaped. The young thief, with the stolen purse warm in his coat, made his way home through the dark village. He was not a wicked boy, only a poor and a hungry one, with a sick mother and an empty pot at home. The coins in the purse meant bread and a little meat and perhaps medicine, and so he had taken them. This was the truth of much village theft. It was not greed, but need that drove the hand. A hard winter, a failed harvest, a death in the family, and a man or a boy grew desperate. And the line between the honest poor and the petty thief was a thin one, easily crossed in a lean year. It is easy, from a warm and a full life, to judge such a one harshly, the boy who took what was not his. But hunger is a hard master, and a sick mother a hard sight, and the coins lay there, almost asking to be taken. He knew it was wrong, for he had been taught it, in the church at his mother's knee, all his short life. The boy crept into his cottage, where a single rushlight burned low, and his mother lay abed. He set down the purse and counted the coins by the dim flame, and his heart was glad and heavy at once. Glad of the bread it would buy, heavy at how it had come, and at the thought of being found out, for he knew the danger he was in. Theft was a serious thing, and the law was hard upon it. A man could be set in the stocks for it, or worse, far worse, if the sum were judged large enough. And the boy lay awake a long while, the coins hidden, the rushlight guttering, his thoughts uneasy. Outside, the village slept, and the night was still, and the cut purse was not yet missed. But the morning would come, and with it the discovery and the slow turning of the village mind. And the boy, lying in the dark, knew that he had set something in motion that he could not now stop. There was, in the village, an older and gentler answer to want than theft, and it must be told. For the medieval world, hard as it was, believed deeply in charity, in the giving of alms to the poor. It was held a Christian duty and a path to grace, to feed the hungry and to clothe the bare. And so the poor were not always left to steal. There were ways that need was met in part. The church gave alms, a portion of its goods set aside for the relief of the destitute. The wealthy gave at their gates a loaf, a coin, a bowl of pottage to those who came begging. And the great monasteries fed many at their doors each day, the poor lining up with their bowls in the grey morning. A man fallen on hard times might be helped by his neighbours, quietly, without shame. A widow with children might find her field ploughed by other hands, her need answered without asking. For the village looked after its own in the main, and did not lightly let one of its number starve. This is worth remembering beside the tale of the thief, that charity too was woven through that world. The same village that put a man in the stocks would also feed his children while he sat there. Justice and mercy lived side by side, neither one driving out the other entirely. The young thief perhaps might have asked and been helped had he not been too proud or too afraid. Many were. They took the harder road of theft rather than the road of the open hand. But the open hand was there, all the same, and many a poor soul was kept from crime by a neighbour's kindness. And so the alehouse emptied at last, the brawlers parted, the purse not yet missed in the dark. But morning would come, and with it the market and the court and the answering for the night's wrongs. So let us follow the lane now into the grey dawn, toward the market square where the punishments waited. In the morning the village wore a different face, busy and bustling, for it was a market day. The square before the church filled with stalls and trestles, and the country folk came in from round about. There was the smell of fresh bread, and of fish, and of livestock, and the calling of sellers, crying their wares. Eggs and butter, cloth and cord, pots and pans, a pig in a pen, a basket of late apples. The square was the village's marketplace, its meeting place, the heart of its public life. And here, where all the world could see, stood the instruments of the village's harsher justice. For in the market square, set up plainly for all to behold, were the stocks and the pillory. The stocks, a heavy frame of timber, low to the ground, with holes to hold a man's ankles fast, and the pillory, taller, with holes for the head and the hands, that held a man upright and on show. They stood there always, in good weather and bad, a quiet warning to every passer-by. Empty most days, weathered grey by sun and rain, they waited for the next offender. And on a market day, with the square full, they did their cruellest and most useful work. The wood of them was old and smooth, worn by the weather and by the many who had sat or stood in them. The grain had silvered with the years, and the iron pins had rusted to a deep red brown, and children climbed upon the empty frames on quiet days and played and were scolded off them by their mothers. For the punishment of this place was not always pain. More often it was shame, to be held fast in the stocks or the pillory, in the busy square, before all one's neighbours. That was the heart of it. Not the body's hurt, but the burning of the watched and helpless face. For a man's good name was a real possession in a place where all knew him and would know him always. To be shamed before the whole village was to lose something that could not be quickly bought back. And the stocks and the pillory struck at exactly that, at the name, the standing, the face, a man showed his neighbours. Let us look more closely at the stocks, that low and simple frame of oak. It was made of two heavy beams, set one above the other, with rounded holes cut where they met. A man was made to sit upon the ground, and his ankles were placed in the holes, and the beam closed down. And there he sat, his legs held out before him, fastened fast, unable to rise or to walk away. He could move his arms and turn his head and speak, but his feet were trapped, and he was fixed in place. For hours he sat so in the open square, exposed to the weather and to every eye that passed. It was not, in itself, a great agony. The body was not racked or beaten in the stocks, but it was a long and a wearing trial, all the same, in its own slow way. The hard ground beneath, the stiffness creeping into the held legs, the sun or the cold rain upon the head. And worse than any of that was the helplessness and the being seen and the being mocked. For the people passed close by on their market business, and they looked, and some of them jeered. A few might toss a clod of earth, and the man could not move to turn away from it. The offences that earned the stocks were the lesser ones: drunkenness, idleness, small cheating, sharp words. A day in the stocks for the brawler, perhaps, or the alewife who gave short measure once too often. A punishment fitted to a small wrong. A few hours of shame, and then home, the lesson taught. There was a rough fairness in the choosing of it, this matching of the punishment to the size of the fault. The village did not break a man for a small thing, nor let a large thing pass with a small answer. And the stocks, low and plain, sat at the gentler end of it all, the answer to the ordinary stumbles of ordinary men. A man sat there, had time to think through the long, slow hours of the folly that had brought him low, the ale that had loosened his fists, the sharp word he need not have spoken, the small cheat that had been seen, time enough in the stocks to regret and to resolve, and to wait for the freedom that would come with the dusk. The pillory was the elder brother of the stocks, taller and harsher, and more shaming still. It was a wooden frame set upon a post, with a board that opened and closed about the neck. There were holes for the head and for the two hands, and once closed, a man was held standing, bent and fixed. He could not sit, nor turn away, nor shield his face, nor cover his head from what was thrown. He stood, hour upon hour, his neck and wrists held in the wood, his face turned helplessly to the crowd. It was a posture of utter helplessness, and that was the very point of it. The pillory was for the cheats and the frauds, those who had wronged the public trust. The baker who sold loaves baked light short of their proper weight to cheat his customers. The seller who passed off bad goods as good, the false witness, the spreader of lies. For there were laws, strict ones, about bread, the very staff of life that all men depended on. The weight of a loaf was fixed by custom and by statute, rising and falling with the price of grain. And a baker who gave short weight was thought to steal from the very mouths of the people, and was dealt with harshly. And often the punishment was made to fit the crime in a plain and pointed way. The baker of light loaves might stand in the pillory with his bad bread hung about his neck. The seller of rotten fish might have the fish strung up beside him, for all to see and to smell. So the crowd knew at a glance what the man had done, and why he stood there shamed. And they jeered him for it, and he could do nothing but endure and wait out the hours. It was rough justice and a hard hour, but the village held it just, and a fair warning to the rest. And there was a plain sense in matching the shame to the trade, in hanging the bad bread about the baker's neck. For then no word was needed, no notice read out, no explaining of the crime to the gathered folk. The thing itself told the tale, the light loaf, the rotten fish, the false measure, hung up for all to read. Now let us speak gently of the crowd, for it was the crowd that gave the shaming its sting. A man alone in the stocks, in an empty square, would suffer little but stiffness and boredom. It was the watching eyes, the laughing mouths, the pointing hands that turned the wood into a punishment. On a market day, the square was full, and a man sat in the stocks, drew a ring of onlookers. Children gathered first, curious and bold as children are, to stare and to call out names. Then the grown folk, pausing in their business, to look and to nod, and to murmur to one another. Some watched in silence and went on their way, thinking their own thoughts of pity or of scorn. Others stayed and laughed and tossed soft spoiled things, mud and bruised, fruit and worse. And the man in the stocks bore it all, his face burning, unable to answer or to move. It was a public thing, this justice, and that was no accident, but the heart of its design. The whole village saw the wrongdoer punished, and the whole village learned the lesson together. Do this, and you too will sit here, held fast, while your neighbors laugh and your children watch. And yet there was a limit to the cruelty, for the man was a neighbor and would be free by evening. Tomorrow he would walk among them again, and the jeering of today would be half forgotten, for the village had to live with itself, and its justice, harsh as it was, did not seek to break a man for good. And some in the crowd, watching, felt no mirth at all, but a quiet unease, or even pity, for they knew it might be their turn one day, that any man might stumble and find himself in the wood. There, but for fortune, a watcher might think, and hold his tongue, and pass on without a jeer. And so the brawler from the alehouse came, that very market morning, to sit in the stocks. The matter had been swift, for the wrong was plain, and many had witnessed it the night before. The reeve had heard the account and judged a few hours in the stocks a fitting answer to the blows. The man was led to the square and made to sit, and his ankles were placed in the worn holes. The beam came down and was pinned, and there he was, fixed fast before the busy market. His cut lip had scabbed in the night, and his eye was darkened, the marks of his folly plain to see. He sat with his head bowed at first, for the shame of it was sharp among so many he knew. His neighbours passed, and some shook their heads, and some smiled, and a few spoke a teasing word. The very man who had drunk with him the night before now saw him brought low in the daylight. But as the hours wore on, the shame dulled a little, worn smooth by the long sitting. The market went on about him, the buying and selling, the calling and the haggling, and he became, in time, just a part of the scene, a man in the stocks on a market day. By afternoon, his legs were stiff and aching, and he longed only to be free and gone. And when at last the beam was lifted, he rose slow and sore, and limped away without a word. He had paid his small price for the brawl, and the village had seen it paid, and the matter was closed. And in the days that followed, little more was said of it, for the punishment had wiped the slate. He had answered for his folly in the open before all, and that was held to be enough. No one spoke of barring him from the alehouse, nor of holding the brawl against him for years to come. There was one offence that fell, more often than not, upon the women of the village. It was the offence of the scold, the woman whose tongue was held too sharp, too loud, too quarrelsome, the one who stirred up strife among the neighbours, who spread tales, who railed and shrieked in the lane. It seems a small thing to us now, a hard word, a piece of gossip, a quarrel between wives. But in a village where all lived close, a bitter tongue could poison the peace of a whole lane. And so the scold was reckoned a real offender, and there were punishments set aside for her. She might be set in the stocks like any other, to sit in shame before the square. Or, for the worst and most persistent, there was a special and a curious device, the cucking-stool, a chair set on a long beam, in which the scold was bound, and then lowered down into the village pond. The cold ducking was held a fitting cure for a hot tongue, water against fire, as they saw it, and the village would gather at the pond to watch the scold dipped, and to call out, and to laugh. It was rough, and it was unkind, but it was the village's blunt answer to the trouble she had made. We may pity her now, the sharp-tongued woman, ducked and shamed before her neighbours. Often she was only poor or lonely or wronged herself, and her tongue her only weapon. But the village prized its peace and dealt hard with any who broke it, by blow or by bitter word alike. For the peace of a village was a fragile thing, easily torn, and slow and hard to mend once torn. A feud between two households could poison a whole lane for a generation, souring every meeting and every day. And so the village watched its quarrels closely and stepped in early before a small spite grew into a great one. By the end of a market day, the square began to empty. The stalls came down. The crowds thinned. The country folk gathered their unsold goods and their purchases and set off home along the lanes. And the stocks and the pillory, their day's work done, stood empty once more in the fading light. For the shaming was never meant to last beyond the day. It was a sharp lesson, not a long one. The offender sat his hours, bore his shame, and then was freed to go home like any other. There was no prison to hold him longer, no record to follow him for years to come. And this was the strange mercy buried inside the harshness of it all. The punishment was brief and public, and then it was over, and life closed back over it. The man who had sat in the stocks at noon sat by his own fire at night, free and chastened and home. His neighbours would remember, of course, for the village forgot nothing entirely. But they would not shun him forever. He was one of them still, and would be needed at the next harvest. And so the small justice did its work, and then let the man return to the fold, the peace restored. There is something almost gentle in it, beneath the jeering and the mud. A wrong was done and answered in the open, and then it was finished, and the man taken back. And the square grew quiet, and the light grew long, and the village settled toward its evening rest. Beyond the cottages and the green stood the great house of the manor, the home of the Lord. It was the largest building in the village, of stone and stout timber, with a high, steep roof. And at its heart was the hall, a long and lofty room where the household ate and gathered and held court. The hall was grand by the villagers' measure, though plain enough by the standards of a city or a castle. A great hearth in the middle of the floor, the smoke rising to a hole in the high roof, above, long tables and benches, a raised dais at one end for the Lord, and rushes strewn across the floor. It was here, in this hall, that the manor court was held, the Lord's own court of justice. This was a graver thing than the moot upon the green, and it dealt with weightier matters, the holding of land, the duties owed to the Lord, the larger disputes and the larger wrongs. The Lord himself might preside, seated upon the dais in his fine robes, above the gathered villagers. Or, more often, his steward sat in his place, for the Lord had many manors and could not be at all, and the villagers stood below in the body of the hall, summoned to answer or to give their account. The hall in winter was a place of smoke and shadow, the fire smouldering, the high roof lost in the gloom. Dogs lay among the rushes, and the cold came up through the floor, and the breath of the gathered folk hung in the air. And yet it was the grandest room most of them would ever stand in, and they came to it with a certain awe. It was a place of more solemnity than the green, with its high roof and its smoky air. The Lord's power was felt here, and his justice, which the villagers could not refuse. And so they came, when summoned, and stood and waited to hear how the court would deal with them. The hall held the long history of the manor within its smoke-darkened walls and its worn stone floor. Here the Lord's father had held court, and his father before him, back through the generations. The same benches, the same dais, the same high roof had seen 100 years of judgments given. The man who most often ran the manor court was not the Lord himself, but his steward. The steward was the Lord's chief officer, a man of learning and authority, who managed the estate. He kept the accounts, he oversaw the reeve, he held the courts, and he saw to the Lord's interests. He was, more often than not, an educated man who could read and write and reckon figures. He understood the customs of the manor and the law and the long records of the court rolls. And when he sat in the Lord's place to hold the court, his word carried the Lord's own weight. In a world where few could read, the steward's learning set him apart and gave him a quiet power. He could turn to the written roll and settle a dispute that the villagers carried only in their failing memory. And so the parchment and the pen in his careful hands became as much a tool of justice as any judge's word. He was a figure both respected and feared, for he held real power over the villagers' lives. He could levy fines and enforce duties, and judge disputes, and his judgments stood. And yet he was bound too by the custom of the manor, and could not simply do as he pleased. A good steward was firm but fair, and knew the village, and gave just measure in his rulings. A bad one was harsh, or grasping, or quick to fine, and made the villagers' lives a misery. And the village could tell very quickly which kind of steward had been set over them. A grasping steward could make the years a burden, finding fault where there was little, fining where he might have forgiven. But a fair one was a quiet blessing, and the village knew it, and gave him a grudging respect. For much of the texture of their lives rested in his hands, in his rulings, and his temper, and his sense of right. On this day the steward sat upon the dice, a roll of parchment before him, the clerk at his side. He was a careful man, neither cruel nor soft, who did his Lord's business and kept the record straight. And he looked out over the gathered villagers and called for the first matter to be brought. The manor court was called to order, and the villagers fell quiet, and the business began. The clerk read out the names of those who owed suit to the court, those bound to attend, and any who were absent without good cause were noted down to be fined a small sum for their failure. Then the matters were brought forward, one by one, in their proper order, to be heard. The transfers of land, when one man took over the holding of another, paid for and recorded. The deaths, when a tenant had died, and his heir came forward to claim the holding and pay his due. These were the great workings of the manor, the slow turning over of land and duty and right. A man might hold his strips of field in the great open fields of the village, scattered here and there. And when he died, or sold, or surrendered them, it was the court that set the change in order. Each transfer had its fee, paid to the Lord, and its entry on the roll, written by the clerk. The heir paid his heriot, often the best beast of the dead man, given up to the Lord as his right. And then the holding passed properly and lawfully, and the village's order was preserved. It was dry business, much of it, the reading of names, the noting of fees, the recording of land. But it was the very bones of the village's life, the structure beneath the daily round. And the steward worked through it steadily, matter by matter, while the villagers stood and waited their turn. The order of it mattered, this slow and proper working through, for it was the law made visible. Each matter in its place, each name in its turn, each fee set down in the clerk's patient hand. For an arbitrary lord might do as he pleased, but a court that followed its forms was a court that could be trusted. Among the matters that day was a dispute between two men over the boundary of their fields. In the great open fields, each man's land lay in narrow strips, divided only by a furrow or a ridge. And it was easy, over the years, for one man's plough to creep a little into another's strip. The two men stood before the steward, each claiming that the other had ploughed across the line. One said his neighbour's furrow had eaten into his land a hand's breadth, then another, year by year. And the other denied it, and said the boundary had always run where his own plough now ran. It was a hard matter to settle, for the strips were old, and the marks between them faint. There were no fences here, no walls, only the memory of where the line had always been. And so the steward did as such cases required. He called upon the old men of the village. The elders came forward, the grey-haired men who had worked these fields all their lives, and they were asked where the boundary had run in their own youth and in their father's time. And they conferred and pointed, and one of them recalled an old stone, half buried, that had marked the line. The stone was sought and found where the old man said, sunk deep in the grass and the earth. And by it the true boundary was settled, and the steward gave his judgment, and the encroacher set back his plough. And the matter was entered on the roll, the old man's memory made law, the dispute laid to rest. It is worth pausing on how much rested in that world upon the recollection of a few old men. A boundary, a right, a duty, all could turn upon what a grey-haired neighbour swore he remembered. And mostly it served well enough, for the old men were honest, and their memories long and clear. The most common business of the manor court after the land was the levying of fine. For a great many small offences were answered not with the stocks, but simply with a sum of money. And these fines, paid to the lord, were a steady and a welcome stream of income to the manor. A man who had broken a rule of the manor would be amerced, as it was called, set a fine to pay, for letting his beasts stray onto the Lord's meadow, for taking wood from the Lord's forest, for ploughing badly, or for failing in some duty owed, or for any of 100 small faults. The fines were not large, a few pennies here, a few there, set according to the offence. And they were assessed often by the man's own neighbours, who knew what he could bear to pay, for it was held unjust to ruin a man with a fine, and so the sum was fitted to his means. The clerk wrote each one down upon the roll, the name, the fault, the sum, in his cramped brown hand, and the man would pay, then or later, and the matter was closed, and the Lord's coffer a little fuller. It was a quiet, endless business, this taking of small fines, the daily revenue of justice. A penny here, 2 pence there, a halfpenny for a small slip. The sums seem trifling to us now. But a penny was a real thing to a villager, perhaps a day's wage, or the price of a good meal. And so even a small fine was felt and remembered, and was punishment enough for the lesser sort of fault. For the Lord, the court was not only a way of keeping order, but a way of earning income. Every fine, every fee, every heriot flowed in to swell his purse year upon year. And so justice and profit were woven together here, the keeping of the peace and the filling of the Lord's hand. It would be wrong, though, to think the court was only a means of squeezing coin from the villagers. For the fines kept the rules, and the rules kept the peace, and the peace was worth more to all than any penny. A man fined for letting his beasts stray learned to mend his fence, and his neighbour's meadow was spared. One matter that day touched on a thing the Lord guarded jealously, the game in his woods. For the forests and the wild creatures in them, the deer, the boar, the hares, the birds, were the Lord's, and to hunt them, to take them without his leave, was a serious offence called poaching. A villager had been caught with a snare set in the Lord's wood, and a hare taken in it. He was brought before the court to answer for it, and the evidence, the snare and the hare, was shown. And the man did not deny it, for there was no use, but he pleaded his hunger and a hard winter. The taking of game was a temptation always, for the woods were full of meat, and the poor were lean. A single hare, a single bird, could feed a family for a day, and the woods seemed to offer it freely. But the law was clear and hard, that the game was the Lord's, and the poor must keep their hands from it. The steward heard the man, and was not without some pity, for the winter had indeed been hard. But the offence could not be passed over, for to do so would be to invite the whole village to poach. And so a fine was set, as heavy as the man could bear, and a warning given against any further taking. The man paid in time and kept from the woods after for the fine had been a real blow, and the hare, that once stolen meal, had cost him dear in the end, far more than its worth. But his children had eaten that one hard night, and perhaps to him the price was not too high. The Lord's forests were a world apart, dark and full of game, and forbidden to the common folk. A man might pass them every day and see the deer move between the trees and the hares break from cover, and all of that meat that might have fed his lean family was kept for the Lord's own table and his sport. By the late afternoon, the business of the manor court was done, the last matter heard and judged. The land had been transferred, the disputes settled, the fines levied, the rolls written up, and the steward looked over his parchment and was satisfied and called the court to an end. The villagers, released at last, began to file out of the great hall into the cooling day. Some went lighter, their matters settled in their favor, their right confirmed, their claim secured. And some went heavier, with a fine to pay, or a judgment gone against them, grumbling low. But all of them went home, to their cottages and their suppers, the day's solemn business behind. For the court was a thing apart from daily life, a grave and formal interruption of the round. And once it was over, the village returned to itself, to its fields and its fires and its small concerns. The clerk rolled up the parchment and tied it and set it away with the others, the record made. The steward rose from the dais and stretched and turned to the Lord's other business of the day, and the great hall emptied and grew quiet, and the fire in the central hearth burned low. Another sitting of the court was done, another set of judgments added to the long record. The slow machinery of the manor had turned once more, and order had been kept, and life went on, and the long shadows fell across the green as the villagers walked home, the day declining toward its close. In every village there was need, now and then, to hold a man fast for a while. Not as a punishment in itself, for the medieval world did not in the main punish by long imprisonment, but to keep a man secure until he could be brought to trial or until the justices came round. And so there was, in most villages, a small and rough place of holding, the lockup or the jail. It might be no more than a single stout room with a heavy door and a small barred window. Sometimes it was built into the church tower, or set beneath the manor, or stood apart, a little stone hut. It was a comfortless place, dark and damp and cold, with little in it but bare stone and straw. There was no thought of comfort, for it was not meant to be lived in, only endured for a time. A man held there, waited in the dim and the cold for whatever was to come. This was the great difference between their world and ours in the matter of punishment. For we lock men away for years as the punishment itself, but they did not, in the main, do so. To them, prison was a waiting room, not a sentence. The punishment came after, in the fine, the shaming, or worse. The lockup of our village was a low stone building near the church with a single iron-bound door. Inside was one room with a high, small window that let in a little grey light and the cold. A heap of old straw in one corner, a bucket and the bare floor, and the close and musty air. The walls were thick and damp, and they held the cold of winter long into the spring. There were marks scratched upon the stone by those who had waited there before, tallies of the slow days, a name, a cross, and the heavy door, when it was shut and barred, made a sound that those who heard it did not soon forget. It was not a place where anyone stayed long, for the law did not hold men long before their trial. But for those who waited there, the hours were slow, and the dark was heavy, and the cold went deep, and the village, going about its day outside, knew that someone was held within, and spoke of it low. It was a strange thing to have a man shut up in the midst of the busy village, so near and so cut off. The children were told to keep away from it, and they did, mostly, though they stared at the barred door, and the grown folk, passing, would glance at it and think of the one inside and go quietly on. Within the lockup that evening, a man sat upon the straw, waiting for the morrow. He had been taken for a theft, a real one, the stealing of goods of some value from a neighbor's store, and the matter was too grave for the stocks. He must be held and brought before the justices in due time. He sat with his back against the cold stone wall, his knees drawn up, his arms about them. The light from the high, small window had nearly gone, and the room was sinking into dark. And he listened to the small sounds of it, the drip of damp, the scratch of some creature in the straw. He was not chained, for the door was stout, and there was nowhere to go in any case. But he was held and helpless, and his fate was no longer in his own hands, and he knew it. The waiting was the hardest part, perhaps the long hours with nothing to do but think. He thought of his cottage and his family, and what would become of them now. He thought of the trial to come, and of what the justices might do, and his stomach turned cold. For theft of any size was treated hard, and a man could lose much or all for it. The village brought him food, for even a prisoner must eat a little bread, a little ale. It was left at the door, and he took it, and ate in the dark, and the night closed in around him. And he settled at last upon the straw, and waited, as he must, for the morning and the law. The hours of the night stretched long for him, far longer than any hours of work in the fields. For labor passed the time, and tired the body toward sleep. But here there was only the waiting. He counted the slow drips of the damp, and listened to the wind, and learned how heavy an idle, fearful hour can be. Not all who were held or who came before the courts were thieves or men of violence. For there was another trouble that brought a man low, and could even see him locked away, and that was debt, the owing of money that one could not pay, the oldest of village troubles. In a world where coin was scarce, men lived much upon credit, upon promises and trust. A man bought his seed corn on the promise to pay at harvest. He borrowed to see out a hard winter. And when the harvest failed, or the winter ran long, the promise could not be kept, and the debt stood. The creditor, wanting his money, would bring the matter before the court and seek his due. And the court would hear it, and if the debt were proven, would order the debtor to pay. But a man who has nothing cannot pay, and there lay the hard knot of the thing. His goods might be seized, his beasts, his pots, his very tools, to be sold against the debt. He might be made to work it off, or to give up some right, or to find a friend to stand surety for him. And if all else failed, in some places, the debtor might be held until the debt was somehow met. There was little cruelty meant in it, only the plain need to see that debts were paid and trust upheld. For if a man could borrow and never repay, then no one would lend, and the whole web of credit would unravel. And so the law leaned hard upon the debtor, not out of malice, but to keep the village's promises whole. It was a hard fate to be ruined or held for the want of a little money one could not raise. And it fell most often upon the unlucky rather than the wicked, the man whom the seasons had betrayed. But the law of debt was firm, for trust was the very mortar of the village, and a broken promise could not be let pass. And yet the court was not without sense in such matters, and would not always crush a man for his ill luck. It might give him time, a season more to pay, a chance to bring in a harvest and set things right. For a debtor ruined was a debtor who could never pay, and that served no one, neither lender nor village. There was a custom that softened a little the hard fate of the accused and the indebted. It was the custom of standing surety, of pledging, when a man would vouch for another before the court. A neighbor or a friend or a kinsman would come forward and offer himself as a guarantee. If a man were accused and must wait for trial, a surety might keep him from the lockup. The pledge would swear to the court that he would see the accused appear when the day came, and on that promise the accused might go free in the meantime, back to his home and his work. But the pledge took a real risk upon himself in doing so, for the promise had teeth. If the accused fled and did not appear, the surety himself would answer for it and be fined. And so a man did not lightly stand pledge for another. He did it only for one he truly trusted. This bound the village closer still, each man's freedom resting at times on another's word. A man kept faith in part because his friend had pledged for him and would suffer if he broke it. And so the chains of trust ran all through the village, holding it together where there were no chains of iron. For the prisoner in the lockup, a surety might mean the difference between the dark cell and his own hearth. And many a man, waiting on the straw, hoped a friend would come and stand for him and set him free to wait at home. It was a kindness and a risk and a sign of how deeply the village rested upon trust between its own. The graver crimes, the ones the village could not judge itself, waited for the coming of the justices. For there were judges who travelled the land, sent by the king, going from county to county in their circuit. They came round to the chief towns at set times, and there they heard the serious cases that had gathered. This was the king's justice, reaching out from the distant centre into the villages and the shires. The great wrongs, the killings, the large thefts, the grave offences were kept for these travelling judges, and the accused were held or pledged, and the witnesses gathered until the justices should come. It might be a long wait, for the judges came but seldom, perhaps once or twice in a year. And so a man taken for a grave crime might wait many months, held or pledged for his day in court. The lockup was a place of waiting, then, as much as anything, a holding place, until the law arrived. When the justices came at last, it was a great event, and the country flocked to the town. The accused were brought before them, and the charges read, and the cases heard, one after another. And the judges, learned and stern, gave their verdicts, and the law took its course, swift and grave. For our prisoner waiting on the straw, this was the day he both dreaded and longed for. An end to the waiting, but an end he could not foresee, for the justices held his fate in their hands. And so he waited, as so many had waited before him, for the slow wheel of the king's justice to turn. The night in the lockup was the longest the prisoner had ever known, or so it seemed to him. The dark was complete, for there was no candle, only the faint grey square of the high window, and through it came the cold and the small sounds of the night, and now and then the call of an owl. He could not sleep, though he was weary, for his thoughts ran on and would not be stilled. He lay upon the straw and listened to the village settling into its rest beyond the walls. A door closing, a dog barking far off, the wind in the thatch, and then a deep and total quiet. And in that quiet he was utterly alone, more alone than he had ever been in his crowded life. For in the village a man was never truly alone, always among neighbors and kin and the daily round. But here, in the dark cell, he was cut off from all of it, held apart, a man set aside from his world. He thought of how he had come to this, the want, the temptation, the quick and foolish act, and he wished it undone with all his heart, but it could not be undone, and he knew it. And so he lay and waited for the dawn, and the cold light to come grey through the little window. At last, toward morning, a thin exhaustion took him, and he drifted into a broken, shallow sleep. And the village slept too, all about him, behind its latched doors and its banked fires. And the night passed over the lockup, and the cottages, and the green, and the dark fields beyond. And so the prisoner waited out his night, alone, for the slow coming of the king's justice. For the gravest matters were not for the village to judge, nor for the stocks, nor for a fine. They went out at the last to the edge of the village, to the place of trial and of the final reckoning. In the older days, before the travelling judges and their measured law, there had been another way. When a man was accused and there was no proof, and his guilt or innocence could not be told, they turned in their helplessness to a higher judge than any man, and that was the trial by ordeal. The idea behind it was simple, and to them it was not strange, but solemn and full of faith. God, they believed, would not let an innocent man suffer, nor a guilty man go free. And so they would put the accused to a test, a painful one, and watch to see how God would judge. The ordeal was a solemn thing, hedged about with prayer and fasting and the blessing of the priest. The accused would prepare for days beforehand, and the iron or the water would be blessed before its use, for it was held to be God's own judgment, and so it was approached not lightly, but with deep and fearful reverence. There was the ordeal by hot iron, in which the accused must carry a piece of heated metal. He would carry it a set number of paces, and then his hand would be bound up and sealed. And after some days the binding was opened, and the wound was looked at, and the verdict read in it. If the burn had healed cleanly, it was a sign of innocence, of God's favor and protection. But if it festered and grew foul, then God had spoken against him, and he was held guilty. There was the ordeal by water too, the accused bound and lowered into a blessed pool to see if he sank or floated. It seems a cruel and a fearful thing to us now, this trusting of a life to a burn or a ducking. But to them it was an act of faith, a handing over of the hardest judgments to God himself. For when men could not know the truth, they asked heaven to show it in the only way they knew. We should not be too quick to scorn them for it, those who trusted a burn or a ducking to tell the truth. For they lived in a world without our means of proof, without our patient sifting of fact from fact. When all human knowing failed, and a man's life hung on a truth no one could see, they turned to God. In time, the trial by ordeal passed away and was used no more, and a better way came in. For the church itself grew uneasy with it, and at last forbade its priests to take part. And without the blessing of the church, the ordeal lost its meaning and slowly fell out of use. In its place came a thing we know well, the trial by a jury, by a body of one's neighbors. A group of local men who knew the parties and the country were sworn to find the truth. They weighed what was said and what was known and gave their verdict, and the judge gave sentence upon it. In the earliest days, the jurors were not so much witnesses to the trial as witnesses to the man. They were chosen because they knew him and the deed and the country round, and could speak to all of it. And only slowly, over the long years, did the jury become what we know now, the hearers and the weighers of evidence. This was a great change, the moving from God's judgment to the judgment of men. From the hot iron and the cold water to the sworn word of 12 honest neighbors. And it was, for all its faults, a fairer and a steadier way to find the truth of a matter. The jury was not perfect. The men might be swayed, or mistaken, or know too much, or too little. But it was a judgment by reason, and by evidence, and by the common sense of ordinary men. And it rooted the law, once more, in the village and its people, rather than in iron and fire. And so by the time of our village, the ordeal was a thing of the past, half remembered, half legend. The old folk spoke of it, of how things had been done in their grandfather's day, with a shake of the head. And the prisoner who waited now would face not the hot iron, but the sworn word of his neighbors. At the very edge of the village, on a low rise where two old roads met, stood the gallows. It was a plain and grim thing, a beam set across two posts, weathered grey, stark against the sky. And it was the mark of the gravest justice of all, the place where the worst offenders met their end. For the medieval law was hard, and for the most serious crimes the penalty was death, murder, and the larger thefts, and treason against the king, and a few grave wrongs besides. These were not answered with the stocks, nor a fine, nor even the lock-up, but with the rope. The gallows stood apart, on the edge of things, between the village and the wild beyond. It was placed there on purpose, at the boundary where the roads went out into the world, so that all who came and went would see it and be reminded of the price of grave wrongdoing. Most days it stood empty, a bare frame against the clouds, and the folk passed it with a glance. The crows sat upon it, and the wind moved through it, and the grass grew long beneath. It was simply there, a part of the landscape, a quiet and constant warning at the edge of the fields. The travellers coming to the village saw it first of all, rising on its low hill against the sky. And the villagers, going out to the wider world, passed beneath it as they left, and again as they returned. It marked the boundary of the known and the safe, the line where the village ended and the road began. It is a hard thing to speak of, the gallows, and we will speak of it gently and not dwell. For it was the sternest face of a stern age, the last and heaviest weight of the law. And it stood there, grey and patient, at the edge of the green and ordinary world. The law of that age was hard, and it is right to say so plainly, for it was. A man could lose his life for a theft that, to us, would seem a small thing, the value of a few coins. The penalties were severe, and they fell often hardest upon the poor and the desperate. And yet, woven through that hardness, there ran also threads of mercy, and they too must be told. For the people of that age were not without pity, and the law had its softenings and escapes. Many who might have met the rope did not, for there were ways that the full rigour was turned aside. A jury, unwilling to send a poor man to his death for a small theft, might value the goods low. They would judge the stolen thing worth less than it was, just under the line that brought the gravest penalty. And so, by a kindly undercounting, they would save the man's life and give him a lesser punishment instead. There was the benefit of clergy, by which a man who could read might claim a gentler court. There were pardons granted by the king that lifted the sentence and spared the condemned. And there was sanctuary, the refuge of the church, where a fugitive might flee and be safe for a time. A man who reached the church and laid his hand upon the door was beyond the reach of the law within. He might stay there, fed by the parish, while the matter was weighed, and sometimes find a way to leave the realm in peace. It was an old and a curious mercy, this holy ground that no officer might violate, and many a life was saved by it. So the picture is not all of harshness, though harsh it often was. There was cruelty in that law, and there was also reluctance and pity and the search for a way to be merciful. The people knew their law was stern, and they bent it, where they could, toward kindness. And this bending was not weakness, but a kind of wisdom, a sense that the harshest letter was not always the justest. A jury that undervalued the goods, a lord that granted a pardon, a church that opened its door, all softened the edge. The law stood stern upon the page, but the people who worked it were not made of stone, and they knew mercy too. The day came at last when the prisoner was brought before the justices and his neighbors to be tried. He stood in the open, pale from his long waiting, while the charge against him was read aloud. The theft, the goods, their worth, the manner of the taking, all set out plainly before the court. The witnesses spoke, those who had seen or who knew, telling what they had to tell. The man himself answered as best he could, pleading his hunger and his hard season and his sorrow. And the jury of his neighbors stood by and listened and weighed it all in their slow and careful minds. These were men who knew him, who had known him all his life, and they did not judge him lightly. They knew his family and his troubles and the hard winter that had driven him to it. And they knew, too, the law and what the worth of the goods might mean for his very life. They withdrew to confer among themselves, low-voiced, weighing the matter this way and that. The goods were worth, in truth, just enough to bring the gravest penalty, if so they judged them. But the men were loath to send a neighbor to his death for a single desperate theft. And so they did as juries often did, and valued the stolen goods a little under their true worth, just under the line, so that the crime in law became a lesser one and not a hanging matter. And they came back and gave their verdict, and the man's life was spared by their quiet mercy. It was a small lie in its way, this undervaluing of the goods, and everyone present knew it for what it was. The justices knew it, and the jury knew it, and the law itself, in time, came half to expect it. But it was a lie told in mercy, a bending of the truth to save a life, and few hearts condemned it. The verdict given, and the man's life spared, there remained the matter of his punishment. For though he would keep his life, he had stolen, and that could not be passed over without answer. And so a lesser sentence was given, in keeping with the lesser crime the jury had found. He might be whipped or set in the pillory, or made to give back the value of the goods. Or, in some cases, a man was branded, marked upon the hand, so that all would know what he had done. The mark followed him, a sign of his offense, that he could never quite leave behind. It was a hard punishment still, by our measure, but it was not the end of his life. He would live and return in time to his cottage and his family and his fields, chastened and marked and watched, perhaps, but alive and free and home. The man heard his sentence with a kind of weary relief, for he had feared far worse. He had stood at the very edge, with the gallows in his thought, and he had been drawn back. And whatever shame or pain the lesser sentence brought, it was the price of his life, and he paid it. So the gravest justice in his case had bent toward mercy at the last. The law had shown its hard face, and then its softer one, and the man had been spared the worst. And he went home in the end to the village that had judged him and taken him back and let him live. And the mark upon his hand, if he bore one, would fade in time to a pale and quiet scar. A reminder, when he looked at it, of the night he had stolen and the day he had so nearly lost everything. But it did not stop his hands from working, nor his neighbors from greeting him, nor his children from running to him. There is a thing in the medieval mind about wrongdoing that is worth pausing upon. For to them, a crime, once it was punished, was in a sense paid for and could be set down. The wrongdoer had answered for his deed, and the account was square, and life could go on. This is why the punishments, harsh as they were so often brief and so often public. The man sat in the stocks, or paid his fine, or bore his sentence, and then it was done. There was no long shadow of a record, no following him through the years, no second punishment. The village remembered, of course, for the village always remembered. But the man was not cast out forever. He had paid, and so he was taken back among them. The harvest needed his hands. The community needed his place filled. He was one of them still. There is a kind of wisdom in this, beneath the hardness, that we might pause upon even now, that a wrong, once answered, should be let go, that a man should not be punished without end, that the door should stay open for the one who has paid his price to come back in. And so the man who had been tried and spared and sentenced took up his life once more. His crime was behind him, paid for, set down, a thing that had happened and was over, and the village closed back over it and over him and went on as villages do. So we have seen the whole long round of it, the keeping of the peace in a medieval village. The reeve and the tithing, the hue and cry, the moot upon the green, the court roll and the custom, the alehouse and its brawls, the stocks and the pillory, the manor hall, the lockup and the gallows on the hill. A whole world of justice, without police, without prisons as we know them, held together by neighbors, by trust and by custom, and by the watchful closeness of people who knew one another's lives. Hard in its way and rough and yet rooted, all of it in the community that it served. There is a lesson in it, perhaps, though we need not reach for one, drifting here toward sleep. That justice was once a thing done by neighbors in the open, among people who would meet again tomorrow, not handed off to distant powers, but kept by the community itself, with all its faults and all its care. It was not our justice, and we would not wish it back with its stocks and its hanging tree. But it was theirs, and it suited their world, and it kept the small piece of the village year by year. And it was made not by distant powers, but by the people themselves, judging their own. And now the round is done, and the day declines, and the village settles toward its rest. The court is risen, the prisoner spared, the wrongs all answered, the matters all set down, and a deep and ordinary quiet comes over the green and the cottages and the fields beyond. The gallows stands grey and empty on its hill, against the fading sky. The stocks sit empty in the square. The lock-up door stands open. The hall is dark, and the village breathes out and lets the day go, and turns at last towards sleep. The light is going now, soft and slow, over the small and ordinary village. The last of the market folk have gone home. The fields lie empty and still in the dusk, and a thin blue smoke rises from every cottage where the evening fires are being kindled. In one cottage, the man who was tried and spared sits by his own hearth with his family close. He is home and safe, and the long fear is behind him, and the bread is on the table. Whatever he has paid, and whatever mark he bears, he is here in the warm among his own. In another, the alewife banks her fire and washes her cups, and counts her small day's takings. The brawler, his hours in the stocks long over, sits sore but easy, the lesson learned and done. And the young thief, his theft undiscovered yet, holds his sick mother's hand in the rushlight. Each of them, in their small cottage, is a part of the same slow story, the keeping and breaking of the peace. The wronged and the wrongdoers, the watchers and the watched, all of them neighbors, all of them bound together, and the same dusk falls over every roof alike, the just and the guilty, the punished and the spared. The reeve walks home along the lane, his day's watching done, glad to lay it down for the night. The steward sits in the manor hall, the rolls put away, the Lord's business set in order. And the priest in the church says the evening office, his low voice rising in the empty nave. All of them, the keepers and the kept, the judges and the judged, turning now toward rest. The village that had spent its day in the slow business of justice, settling now into peace. And the dusk comes down, soft and complete, over them all, and gathers them in for the night. In the church, as the dark comes down, the priest stands alone before the dim altar. The day's troubles have all passed through his thoughts, for he knew them, every one. He had heard the confessions and given the counsel, and watched the small dramas of justice unfold. For the priest stood a little apart from the courts and the fines and the stocks. His was a gentler office, the care of souls rather than the keeping of order. And where the law punished the deed, the priest looked to the heart behind it. He had spoken with the thief's mother and brought what comfort he could. He had counseled the brawlers toward peace and the scold toward a softer tongue. And he had prayed quietly for them all, the wrongdoers and the wronged alike. Now he says, the last office of the day, the evening prayer in the empty church. His voice rises low, and even in the gloom, the old familiar words said 1,000 times. And the candles gutter on the altar, and the shadows gather in the corners of the nave. It is a fitting close to the day of justice, this quiet prayer in the dark. The law had done its hard work, and now mercy said its soft words over the sleeping village. And the priest finished and crossed himself and snuffed the candles and went out into the night. Now the fires are being banked all across the village, one by one against the dark. In each cottage, the last log is raked apart and the embers covered over with ash, so that a little warmth and a little spark will keep through the night, ready for the morning. It is the last task of the day, this banking of the fire, done by long and quiet habit. The hands move without thought, raking, covering, smoothing the ash over the glowing coals. And then the room grows dim, lit only by the faint red glow beneath the grey. The cottagers settle, one after another, into their warm and smoky dark. The animals are quiet in their byres, the doors are latched, the shutters are drawn close, and the village, that busy and watchful place, grows still and soft and slow. The green lies empty under the first stars. The stocks and the pillory stand dark and bare. The market square is swept and silent. The stalls all gone, the day's trade long done. And over it all the night comes down, gentle and deep, holding the village close. There is nothing left now to be done or judged or answered for until the morning. The long day of small justices is over, and the village may lay it all down and rest. and the fires glow low beneath their ash, and the dark deepens, and the quiet holds. In the deep of the night, the village keeps a kind of watch, soft and almost unseen. For there were those whose task it was to walk the lanes by night, the keepers of the dark hours. They went their slow rounds, with a lantern perhaps, and a staff, looking that all was well. They checked that the doors were latched, that no fire had broken loose, that no stranger crept about. And if all was quiet, as it almost always was, they called the hour softly and moved on, a low voice in the dark, marking the slow passage of the night, and then silence once more. It was a gentle watching, for the most part, over a sleeping and a peaceful place. The crimes of the day were answered, the wrongdoers were home, or held, or spared, and the night lay quiet over the village, asking nothing of the watchman but his slow and steady round. He passed the dark cottages, and the empty green, and the silent square, and the church. He passed the manor hall, where a single light still burned, and then went dark, and he walked on, alone, in the great stillness, keeping his quiet watch over the sleeping village. There is something restful in the thought of it, the watchman walking while all the rest sleep. Someone awake and gentle in the dark, seeing that all is well, marking the slow hours, and the village sleeping on, safe and unknowing, beneath his patient and unhurried care. And as the night settles deep, a quiet thought drifts through the warm dark, that this wish, this need to live in peace among one's neighbors is as old as people themselves. It was there in the small and watchful village all those long centuries ago. The ways of keeping it have changed. The courts, the laws, the punishments, all changed. But the thing beneath them has not changed at all. It is the same old human need to be safe among one's own, to have wrongs answered, to live in quiet and not in fear. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing to put right. It is only a thing to notice, a long, soft thread running back through all the centuries from the sleeping village to us. The same old wish for peace, kept then by neighbors and custom, kept now in other ways. And it asks nothing of you now, in the quiet, but that you let it drift on by. The villages are gone, and their stocks and their courts upon the green. But the peace they sought, and mostly kept, is the same peace we seek still, and that is a gentle thought to hold. The last light in the village goes out now in the manor hall where the steward sat. A single candle, burning late over the rolls, leans and flickers and shrinks toward the wax. For a moment it brightens, and then it dims, and the long hall sinks into shadow. And then, with the last small breath, the candle gutters out, and the dark is complete. There is the faint red glow of banked embers here and there across the village, and nothing more. The whole place lies under the night, dark and warm and still, from the green to the far fields. Only the soft sounds of the night remain, the wind in the thatch, an owl far off, the watchman's quiet step somewhere in the lanes, growing fainter and then gone, and then a deep and gentle silence settling over everything kind and complete. The village sleeps, the court roll lies, rolled and tied in the dark hall. The gallows stands empty on its hill, and all the small justices of the day are done and laid to rest until the morning. There is only the dark now, and the quiet and the slow, even breathing of a sleeping world. And so the night goes on, as it has for centuries. The courts are risen, the stocks stand empty, the wrongs of the day are all answered and set down. The fires burn low, the village sleeps, and perhaps by now, so do you. If you are still awake, that is perfectly fine. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. The small troubles of the village can wait until morning, as they always have. Let them rest. Let everything rest. The archive will be here tomorrow night, as always. Sleep well.